So that's the second of the three Dharma seals. And the third, of course, is what we call nirvana. In Japanese, Nihan Jakujo. Or more specifically, that nirvana is the extinguishing of flames of passion. Okay? So in the early Buddhist philosophy or teachings, what this extinguishing of flames of passion, so the monks and the nuns, they practice to try ridding themselves of these human passions. But as Buddhism developed, this idea of nirvana became more an underlying truth to all existence. That there is, in Thich Nhat Hanh's book, he compares the waves versus the water of the sea, where the water is nirvana itself, and the waves are the individuals. And the waves don't have to do anything to come in touch with the water of the sea, right, which is nirvana. So nirvana actually transcends both space and time. And when we talk about the Dharma bodies, and I'll talk about that in a bit, this nirvana equals what we call Dharmakaya. So this is where I came up with this epiphany, and I'm going to just do this diagram to talk about the three Dharma seals again. So we have this vertical line. You can all see this, right? Yeah, okay. So this vertical line is what we call the time, okay, or the changes that's constantly happening over time. The impermanence, okay? So this, if you want to take, I don't know which one you want to go from. If the one below is the past and the one going up is the future, maybe, if you want to look at it that way. Then we have this horizontal line, okay? And this line here is the spatial line, space, okay? This is the interconnectedness, that we're all interconnected with everything around us, right? We know this very well through the pandemic, how everybody is very much interconnected, and how the pandemic, the virus spreads from very quickly amongst all human beings, right? This is also the idea of non-self in the three Dharma seals, okay, that we're interconnected spatially as well, okay? So then, if you take the cross point of this time and space, you have this yellow circle in the middle, and that yellow circle is the present, right now, so the here and now. It's also representing Shakyamuni Buddha, more importantly, me or the self, okay? So we're at the crossroads of this space and time continuum, if you will. Now, this is where the epiphany comes in, okay? Because up until now, up until this weekend, in next year. So I started my ministry here in Canada in 1992. So that means next year will be marking 30 years since I started being a minister. And all these years, you know, I've talked about these three Dharma seals, and I've talked about how the one talks about the impermanence, change. The other talks about non-self, how we're all interconnected. And then we have this thing called nirvana. Nirvana is this, that which transcends both time and space. It is like, well, to use a cliche from the movies, it is like the Matrix. It's all around us, right? But what I didn't do up until this weekend, mainly because I really didn't think of it in this idea of time and space until Thich Nhat Hanh had pointed it out. Yes, we talked about change and we talked about interconnected, but I didn't really think of it in those terms of time element or space element. But when you do so, something very interesting happens. Okay, so as I mentioned, in this time element, when we look at the vertical line, and I mentioned earlier how every single thing has its own lifespan, whether it's animate or inanimate. Okay, so from the past and going to the future. Everything in the universe has its own lifespan. In other words, also nirvana transcends both time and space. And nirvana is this Dharmakaya, as I was mentioning earlier. But you can actually say that this vertical line is infinite life. Okay? From the past to the future, it is all of life throughout the universe. It's the infinite life. Okay? In other words, in Jodo Shinshu, or in Pure Land Buddhism, we call this amitayus. Okay? Amitayus, mita, M-I-T-A, means to measure. A makes it negative, and yus, Y-U-S, is life. So, immeasurable life, okay, is this vertical plane. So when the Buddha talks about everything is constantly changing, he's meaning the infinite life, okay? And then when we start talking about the space, that is infinite light. So it is light that transcends, you know, we're all connected spatially, and that's another way of expressing that is infinite light or infinite space. And that, in fact, we say Amitabha, where again, mita means to measure, a is a negative, and ba is the light. So in the Pure Land teachings, Amitabha, they say that the Buddha's light extends through all quarters, all 10 quarters, which, all existence. So spatially, this is talking about Amitabha. Then, now you see this little circle that goes on the outside here, right? This purple circle is representing what we call Amida Buddha, okay? So Amida Buddha expresses itself so that we can get in touch. So myself here, we can get in touch with that which is outside of the circle, this nirvana, thing called nirvana, which is very abstract, has no space, or no form, no shape, no color. And so nirvana itself is very difficult for us to comprehend. And that's why it takes on this form of what we call Amida Buddha. And so this three Dharma seals, if you will, of impermanence, of non-self, of nirvana, can all be summed up in the Pure Land teachings as well. So what I hadn't done up until this weekend is tie the two together. And we can see very clearly that the teachings of Amida Buddha also are represented in these three Dharma seals. So I wanted to share that with you because I thought, wow, this is so cool. It all sort of fits together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that sort of suddenly came, you find the puzzle that fits together, you get this picture. So I just thought that was kind of neat. And then so going back to the book, the three Dharma jewels or treasures in the Buddhist teachings, of course, so for all the different lineages of Buddhism, we have different, we emphasize different sutras or different parts of the teaching. For instance, for us, we belong to what's known as the Pure Land school of Buddhism. So we emphasize what we call the three Pure Land sutras. Those are the teachings that pertain mainly, they talk about Amida Buddha. So those are what we focus on in our Pure Land lineage. And similarly, the various different lineages of Buddhism will emphasize different sutras, so different teachings that the Buddha taught. However, there is something that's universal and common to all Buddhist schools, and whenever we have a larger gathering of Buddhist gatherings, we generally recite what's known as the three treasures or three Dharma jewels. They're called jewels or treasures because they bring value into our lives, right? And the three Dharma jewels are the Buddha, and this is referring specifically to the historical Buddha. Okay? The historical Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama, and he was enlightened at the age of 35, and he became known, one of his more common names that he was known as was Shakyamuni Buddha. And Shakyamuni Buddha is a title, and where Shaka is the clan name that he came from, and Muni means the wise one, or the wise sage. And Buddha itself, it means enlightened or awakened one. So when you put those three together, what Shakyamuni Buddha means is he's the wise one from the Shaka clan who attained enlightenment. Okay? So that's what we're saying when we say Shakyamuni Buddha. It's a title that he is given. The second of the three Dharma jewels or three treasures is what's known as the Dharma, right? It's the teaching of the Buddha, but is at the same time, it's the universal truth that the Buddha awakened to, right? With the Dharma, and I've explained before, it's like the fact that Sir Isaac Newton came up with a mathematical theorem to explain gravity didn't change the fact that the apple falls, right? So whether Sir Isaac Newton came up with a theorem for it or not, the apple's still going to fall. Similarly, the Dharma existed before the Buddha, but he awakened to that truth. Okay? And then the Sangha is the brotherhood or sisterhood of monks and nuns. More broadly, we see it as the community of Buddhist followers. The Sangha also has connotations of circle or harmony. So there's what we call the 5 grave offenses, and one of the offenses is to break the circle or harmony of the Sangha. So that's considered a grave offense. Okay? So this Sangha has that connotation of circle or harmony. Okay, so in our, as I mentioned, that in the gatherings, in one form or another, generally these three treasures, usually a homage and three treasures are read. In our services, we regularly recite what we call the Bandhana Tisarana, which is the homage and three treasures. So the Bandhana is Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. And everybody usually would just say homage to him, the exalted one, the enlightened one, the supreme, the awakened one. So this one here, we're specifically referring to the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, right? And then the Tisarana, the three treasures, Buddham Saranam Gacchami. I go to the Buddha for guidance. Dhamman Saranam Gacchami. I go to the Dharma for guidance. And finally, Sangham Saranam Gacchami. I go to the Sangha for guidance. Now, this is the version that we generally read in our services. But what you'll find in many of the other readings or services is instead of going for guidance, it'll say, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Refuge is a word that implies safe haven, a place of safety. So you go to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha for safety. Now, another way of viewing this, and I've done this before, is shown what we call Venn diagram of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, where in the center, right in the center where all three intersect, this is myself. This is what you have to be. Okay, so this means that if you're at home just reading a book on Buddhism, that's not enough. Because what that has done is that maybe the Buddha and the Dharma have intersected, but you've forgotten the Sangha. So it's very important, all of you, when the pandemic finishes and we're able to attend temple again, please come out and participate in person. This is one form of Sangha, this virtual Sangha that we've created, but this center here is the most important, where all three interact. And the temple is really, truly a place for that to happen. One of the things, when, as I go over my years as a minister, and people have asked me, well, what things have you benefited from being a minister? And one of the things that I will often say is that, the food that we get is the best food. If I was a businessman, for instance, right, I wouldn't get the home cooking of fujinkai, let's say. When we're getting ready for a bazaar and everybody gathers for the meal, of shoyu, wieners, and chow mein, right? Those kind of things. You can't. It's like that MasterCard commercial, right? It's priceless, basically, right? So those kind of experiences are what the Sangha, when the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha come together, we experience that. And you can't compare that, or you can't put a monetary value to such experiences. But that's basically what these three treasures are. And they're reminding us that, that they interconnect. They're three, but they're all one. So again, when the pandemic is over, please do come and participate in person. But, in this book by Thich Nhat Hanh, he actually gave a very beautiful rendition of this Bandhana Tisarana. And I think this is actually quite unique to Thich Nhat Hanh. I haven't seen it written quite like this anywhere else. So this is in your books, by the way. And I will also be sending out these notes afterwards. But, if you look at this, oops, sorry. This is in the way here. Hang on, let me just move. Okay. So the homage begins. Buddha is the teacher showing the way, the perfectly awakened one, beautifully seated, peaceful and smiling, the living source of understanding and compassion. Dharma is the clear path, leading us out of ignorance, bringing us back to an awakened life. Sangha is the beautiful community that practices joy, realizing liberation, bringing peace and happiness to life. And so the three refuges that he talks about, I take refuge in the Buddha, the one who shows me the way in this life. I take refuge in the Dharma, the way of understanding and of love. I take refuge in the Sangha, the community that lives in harmony and awareness. Then these last 6 lines, they're very unique to him, I think. Dwelling in the refuge of Buddha, I see clearly the path of light and beauty in the world. Dwelling in the refuge of Dharma, I learn to open many doors on the path of transformation. Dwelling in the refuge of Sangha, I am supported by its shining light that keeps my practice free of obstacles. So up until this point, it's about him receiving from the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But then, at the very end, he talks about giving. Taking refuge in the Buddha in myself, I aspire to help all people recognize their own awakened nature and realize the mind of love. Taking refuge in the Dharma in myself, I aspire to help all people grasp the way of practice and walk together on the path of liberation. Taking refuge in the Sangha in myself, I aspire to help all people build fourfold communities and encourage the transformation of all beings. Now, I'm not sure what the fourfold community it means itself, but I think, this encapsulates both the receiving and the giving aspects of the three treasures. So in going forward, when we read the homage and three treasures, we may use this version as well in our services, because I do find it a very well written article. So then, that's the three treasures, right? Now, in the book, it also talks about what we call the three Dharma bodies. Now, this is very interesting because the whole concept of the three Dharma bodies actually doesn't get developed until after the birth, the death, the passing of the historical Buddha. And this makes sense because when the historical Buddha was alive, there was no need for 3 different Dharma bodies. If you had any questions, you would go for an audience with the Buddha. Oops, somebody's or chat. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, so this idea sort of develops afterwards. And in order to understand how it developed, I wanted to look at both from a cultural perspective as well as from the actual development of the teachings. And so you can actually tell things by the artwork. The development of Buddhist artwork can teach you a lot as well. And so when the Buddha was actually alive, he admonished, or he didn't agree with the idea of making images of himself or statues of himself because he didn't want to be idolized, basically. So while the Buddha was alive, to represent the teachings, you had various things that they used. Here's one of them, which is the Dhammacakka, or the Dharma wheel, which represents the first of the teachings that got the wheel of Dharma rolling. Another often used symbol was footprints. Okay, this was to denote where the Buddha was at. So they would use these footprints. As you can tell, it's not a statue, it's footprints. Right? By the way, if you go to India, in many of the temples will have these footprints, and then they also have etchings of these footprints that you can get on pieces of cloth as well. And then when he passed away, of course, they had the stupas, the large stupas which held the relics of the Buddha. Okay, it's interesting because these stupas, originally they were to hold the relics of the Buddha, the bones of the cremated Buddha. And when the Buddha first passed away, they split it into 8 pieces, and they made 8 stupas throughout India where the Buddha was associated with. Since then, of course, you know, I'm sure if we add up all the people who have quote-unquote relics of the Buddha, we probably have about 10 different people when you add it all together, because there's so many people that claim they have relics of pieces of relics of the Buddha. In fact, in San Francisco at the BCA headquarters, they also have a relic of the Buddha. So these stupas were where the relics were held. And then later on, as Buddhism developed, when it started moving through Asia, instead of holding relics, it was a place where the treasures of the temple were kept. Basically, the sutras were kept. And they became what we call pagodas. So when you see those tiered pagodas in Asia, the origins were these stupas. Okay. This was the stupa in Sarnath. This is where the deer, right by the deer park where the Buddha gave his first talk. It's a huge stupa, and people will circumambulate it 3 times as the way of worshiping this stupa. Here's a depiction of when the Buddha was born. And this is Queen Maya in the Lumbini's garden. And she's reaching up as, I was thinking it was a salad tree, I could be wrong. As the tree gently bends down, she reaches up to grab the limb, and the Buddha is born. But again, so all these pictures you see, there's no image of the Buddha. But after the Buddha passed away, though, the earliest reliefs that we find, they're carvings that are from the Gandhara area, which is near Pakistan, Afghanistan, northeast part of India. And when you look at the very early reliefs, and here's one example of it, you'll notice that the Buddha is the same size as of all the disciples, right? The only difference is that there's a little halo around his head. So you can see just by his head, there's a little halo. And he also has this cranial bump, which is a sign of his wisdom. But other than that, he's the same size as everybody else. And so what these reliefs are doing is they're just telling a story of the Buddha's life. Okay? He was no larger than anybody else. But over time, what happens is, out of respect and endearment to the Buddha, he ends up becoming more deified. So if you can see this diagram here, the Buddha in the center is much larger than anybody around him. Okay, and this is supposedly depicting that very first teaching at Deer Park. There's a deer in the corner here with, I only see 4 of the disciples. There should be 5 disciples, but there's only 4 here. And yet the Buddha is much larger than those around him. Okay, so he becomes more this deity as time goes by. And this picture here, this is, I'm bringing up, oops, sorry. Let me bring that back. This last picture here, this is more specific for our Pure Land school. So there was some argument that the teachings of Amida Buddha came or was introduced to Buddhism much later on. But this is actually just the foot of a statue with the pedestal that it stood on. And there's some writing on the front here. And basically, in that writing, and this was found in what's known as the Mathura area. And so this is, or the date is actually engraved on this writing in the front. And it says, "For the sake of all beings, I carved this statue of Amitabha." And it's dated as, I think, 105 AD. So we know by this that the ideology of Amida existed as early as this 100 AD in India, central India. So possibly it was there from before as well. But that's not really that important. But when we go into the development of the teaching itself after the Buddha passed away, so we see that the first 100 years, so there's questions as to when the Buddha entered nirvana, when he passed away. And there's several dates, but usually now we're looking at around 386, 383, somewhere around there, BC is more commonly recognized. The other date was 485, but they think that's too old. So after the Buddha passed away, the first thing that they did was the 500 of the greatest monks, they gathered in a place called Rajagrihar, and they held what they called the first Sangha Council. And at this council, the 10 great disciples of the Buddha stood up, and they all started reciting various things that they had heard from the Buddha. And amongst them, Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin, he rehearsed the Dharma, or the Sutra. The Sutra is actually the words of the Buddha, right? So he would begin, "Thus have I heard," and then he would tell what he had learned from the Buddha. And Ananda was one of his closest disciples. He was his direct cousin as well, so very close. And then Upali, who was a barber before he became a disciple, he was known for knowing what they call the precepts or the rules. And so he stood up and gave a discourse on the Vinaya rules. And so this is the first Sangha Council, they called it. And then so for the first 100 years or so, the Buddhist teachings remained very pure and intact. Okay. Then around the end of that, they had what they call the second Sangha Council at a place called Vaishali. And about 100 of or this is about 100 years after the passing of the Buddha. And this is also around the time that they begin to have what they call denominational Buddhism. And so what happens around this time is that you get all these great masters that are starting to make commentaries or interpretations on those teachings of the Buddha, early teachings of the Buddha. And so this is when you get the formation, and they call this the Abhidharma. Abhidharma are the commentaries on the Buddha. And this is when we start beginning to see what we call the Mahayana movement. And this is around the time where we get the formation of what's known as the Tripitaka. So originally the Buddha's teachings was an oral tradition where teacher would talk and the disciple would listen and they would memorize it. And over the course of many years, it became formalized into the form of chanting, because chanting was easier to memorize. So that's how chanting came about. But around this time, it was thought, well, we need to actually have some written recordings of the Buddha. And so they started off by etching these teachings in what the papyrus leaves. They're like palm leaves, right? And they held them in 3 different baskets. And the baskets were the words of the Buddha, or the Sutra Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, which are the rules and regulations, and Abhidharma Pitaka, which is the commentaries. Pitaka means basket. Okay, so when we talk about the collection of the teachings of the Buddha, we call them the Tripitaka. Tri is 3 baskets. Okay, and so the Tripitaka, the words of the Buddha, the rules and regulation, and the commentaries on those teachings. Then as we go further in the development of the teachings, so once the monasteries then begin forming and the structure becomes well organized, the goals of the monks and nuns were to attain nirvana, in this case meaning to extinguish their flames of passion, attaining a state of what is known as arahat. Now, some people look down upon, or it was a common error in the Mahayana tradition, the tradition that part of the tradition that we belong to, is that they look down upon these individuals. They call them Hinayana. Mahayana means larger school, and Hinayana means smaller vehicle. Mahayana is larger vehicle, and Hinayana is smaller vehicle. So when this new movement started developing, they called those individuals who were only really looking to extinguish their own flame to reach this arahatship, they called them the smaller vehicle because they're only thinking of themselves, they said. Okay, but now we don't say Hinayana because it's derogatory. We call them the Theravada school of Buddhism, which is the way of the elders. Okay, and in fact, this whole idea of arahatship, arahat is they are enlightened beings, but their enlightenment is a little different from the enlightenment of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni. So in the Theravada tradition, there is only one Buddha, and that is Shakyamuni Buddha. There are no other, they don't look at all these different other Buddhas. They only look at Shakyamuni Buddha, and he's put in a very special place. So it's out of respect that their enlightenment, they say, is what they call arahat, which is sort of, they just put this discrepancy between the two. The Buddha's enlightenment, Shakyamuni Buddha, and everybody else becomes an arahat. Okay, so it's not derogatory or anything. It's out of respect that they attain arahatship. But the other school of Buddhism, the other movement that happened, was saying they wanted to go more by the ideals of what the Buddha had taught. And that was this. Before passing away, the Buddha said, those who only see the physical body do not see the true Buddha. Those who see the Dharma see the true Buddha. Meaning that the ideals are that everyone could become a Buddha. Everyone, the teachings are the basis for it. And so this new form of Buddhism brings what we call the Bodhisattva path. And along with that, there's sort of an ideological shift that occurs. And this is where you get this idea of the 3 Dharma bodies. Okay, so you get this idea of Dharmakaya, or Hoshin in Japanese. And this is like the universe. It is reality itself. It is thusness, suchness, sunyata. It has no form, no shape, no color, no beginning, no end. So it's very hard for us to even conceptualize. It is true reality. The moment we put a word to it, we've taken away from true reality because we've put a structure around it. Okay? So that's very hard for us to understand. So from that Hoshin is born what they call Sambhogakaya, or Hojin in Japanese. And this actually has a form and shape and a beginning, but no end. So Amida Buddha is one of these Buddhas. It is an expression of the Dharmakaya, which is we can't fathom. So out of that comes this expression of form, so that we know that we can sort of grasp something. We can grasp an idea that there is something beyond. And that's Amida Buddha. And there are many other Buddhas that fall under this category. And this is basically more of a Mahayana ideology than Theravada ideology. And finally, we have what we call Nirmanakaya. And Nirmanakaya actually has a definite shape and form and has a beginning and an end. And an example of that is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, is what we call Nirmanakaya. So the way it's explained is that this Buddha, Shakyamuni, was born into this world so that he can talk about, or he can teach us, lead us to the ultimate reality, or nirvana. So these are what we call the development of the three Dharma bodies. And I think I'm going to end it here tonight. There are some other things that I wanted to get to, but does anybody, you know what, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to unpin myself.